Tom is there for us. Tom, there is a growing expectation there, given the latest poll, of course, in the Times, that they may be, at some stage, preparing for power, or are they keeping their powder dry?
Well, it does seem that the feeling on the floor of this conference is just that many delegates here are for the first time describing the Labour Party, as a government in waiting. That's the first time that we've been hearing those words at a Labour Party conference for a long time. Last year, at the Labour Party's conference in Brighton, there was much constitutional wrangling, battles between the left and the right over rule changes, over selection, over various policy fights too. This year, much calmer. This year it seems like the sort of Starmerites, if we want to coin such a word, have got full control of the Labour Party, that there is less wrangling between those who oppose him and those who support him, although perhaps that's simply because some of those who have been opposing him are not here this year, either chucked out of the party through disciplinary tribunals or simply not elected by their constituency Labour parties to come along as a delegate to this year's conference. Interestingly, I'm going to probably be a little bit overheard there, though. Here we go. We've got a little bit of very loud overhead words there from people saying that the leader's speech will be very, very busy and that people need to arrive early. In fact, just in front of the GBNews stall here, people are already snaking up around the conference hall, lining up to hear that speech that has been trailed as something that will be echoing Tony Blair. And this is a party that will be trying to go for an election in perhaps 2 years' time and win on a Tony Blair scale way. That would be the most remarkable turnaround in the polls, of course, because the Labour Party lost the last election with their worst defeat since 1935. And while there has been some polling good news for the Labour Party, 17 points ahead in the latest YouGov poll that's reported this morning, there is still some question marks over how well the Labour Party leader Sir Keir Starmer is doing. A Savanta Comres poll released in the last half an hour or so has shown that Starmer, whilst ahead of Liz Truss on the best Prime Minister question, is not as far ahead as perhaps might be expected. 37 to 35%. That's the Labour Party leader's lead in the latest best Prime Minister question.
Yeah. And how much detail are we expecting in the speech on policy, Tom? Because Rachel Reeves outlined this idea of a national wealth fund yesterday, but didn't give us too much. I mean, are we going to get, particularly the costings on this? Because that's where they've been criticising the Tories, of course.
Yes, it's unlikely we're going to get that real detail this week at all. The typical strategy here seems to be that if you're ahead in the polls, you don't want to give people reason to scrutinise too much. You don't want to try and create too much news. You want to create a feeling rather than a complete prospectus. Perhaps if the Labour Party were further behind in the polls, they'd be wanting to do more radical things, but ultimately it's a similar strategy to what we saw at the Conservative Party conference last year. It feels like a very long time ago, but the Conservatives then had a commanding lead in the polls and virtually nothing of significance was announced at that party conference. Similarly, at this Labour Party conference, we're hearing little bits of detail. We're hearing the odd policy here. They'll reverse one of these tax cuts, for example, and say they'll use that money to fund some more nurses. Quite how that works, how that would be new money, because they're simply reversing a tax cut that has not yet happened, is less clear. But the more they announce policy, the more they open themselves up to that sort of scrutiny. So I would be very surprised if we see full, costed, detailed policy announcements from Sir Keir Starmer. We'll see one or two new ideas, no doubt, and a big, broad brush theme, but not the sort of detail we'd expect in a manifesto.
But clearly a move to the centre ground, and some people calling it new Labour. I mean, what about those ghosts of 1997? Have we got Gordon Brown, Tony Blair and Lord Mandelson sort of stalking the corridors in the atrium?
Well, Lord Mandelson has been about in the Labour Party conference, but Tony Blair and Gordon Brown have not. At least perhaps their ghosts have been. And indeed, the words of Tony Blair will be echoed around the hall a little bit later. Sir Keir Starmer himself will be quoting the Labour leader, the former Labour leader, the last Labour leader to actually win an election, Tony Blair, in a phrase that he used back when he became leader of the Labour Party. He was taking on the left of the party. He was trying to reform the party. We had what was called the Clause 4 moment, where the Labour Party ditched commitments to nationalisation in the preamble to its constitution. But similarly, Tony Blair moved away from that strong trade union link by saying instead of the Labour Party being the political arm of the trade union movement, he said the Labour Party is the political arm or the political voice of the people of Britain. And that's the phrase that Sir Keir Starmer will be using a little bit later today, echoing the words of Tony Blair and pushing forward this idea that the Labour Party has fundamentally changed. He'll be trying to replicate the success that Tony Blair saw, having won those 3 general election victories. In fact, the history of the Labour Party has been really quite stark. Between 1979 and 1997, not a single win. In fact, 4 consecutive losses. Then 3 wins under Blair, and after that, 4 more consecutive losses.
Indeed. Tom, for the moment, thank you. Back to you and Gloria, of course, in Liverpool as we get that